The maid didn't scream. She gasped, a sharp, trembling sound that froze the entire room. Her hand shook violently as she held up the tweezers, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The boy in the chair didn't blink. He looked straight ahead, pale, tense, as if he already knew something was terribly wrong, something he'd been hiding for months, something he couldn't explain to anyone who would listen. Behind them, the billionaire father staggered backward, clutching his head in complete disbelief. Because what the maid had just pulled from the boy's ear should not have been there. Not in a house this wealthy. Not in a family this careful. Not in a world where everything was supposedly under perfect control. But this was the moment everything shattered. The moment a secret buried for months finally crawled into the light. And what they discovered that day wouldn't just shock the family. It would expose a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Why was the billionaire's son suffering in complete silence? How could no one notice the warning signs that were right there in front of them? What exactly was living inside his ear for all those months? And why did the housekeeper react as if she'd seen something absolutely impossible? These are the questions that haunted everyone who heard this story, a story that began not with horror but with hope. Helen Simmons was 26 years old when she first walked through the massive oak doors of the Grimes estate on that humid Tuesday morning in June. She had worked for wealthy families before, but nothing quite prepared her for the sheer scale of Rick Grimes' mansion. 42 rooms, indoor and outdoor pools, a tennis court, and enough marble to rebuild ancient Rome. But what struck Helen most wasn't the wealth, it was the silence. In a house this big, with this much life supposedly happening, the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. She would later realize that silence was the first warning sign, the first clue that something was terribly wrong in this perfect palace. Rick Grimes had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a single software patent at age 23 and turning it into a technology empire worth over $2 billion by the time he turned 45. He was the kind of man who scheduled his life in 15-minute increments, who answered emails during his son's birthday parties, who believed that success meant never stopping, never slowing down, never looking back. His wife Margaret had been the one who kept the family together, the one who remembered school plays and doctor's appointments, the one who noticed when their son Carl needed new shoes or just needed someone to talk to. But Margaret had been gone for 18 months now, taken by cancer that moved faster than all of Rick's money could fight. And in her absence, the house had become less of a home and more of a very expensive tomb where two people lived separate lives under the same vast roof. Carl Grimes was 17 when Helen first met him, though he looked younger, smaller somehow, as if he was trying to take up less space in the world. He had his mother's gentle eyes but none of her warmth, and when Helen introduced herself that first morning, he barely looked up from his breakfast. Not out of rudeness, she would realize later, but out of exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. The kind that came from fighting a battle no one else could see. He mumbled a greeting and went back to pushing eggs around his plate, his left hand unconsciously rubbing his right ear. A gesture so automatic he didn't even seem aware he was doing it. Helen noticed it immediately. She had always been good at noticing the things people tried to hide. It was a skill she developed growing up in a house where reading the room could mean the difference between a peaceful evening and a terrible one. She noticed how Carl tilted his head slightly to the left when people spoke to him, how he winced at sudden noises, how he kept touching that ear as if trying to relieve some invisible pressure. The first week passed quietly as Helen learned the rhythms of the house. Rick left before sunrise and returned after sunset, often eating dinner alone in his study while reviewing contracts and market reports. Carl attended Preston Academy, the kind of private school where tuition cost more than most people's annual salary, but he came home looking drained, heading straight to his room where he'd stay until dinner. Sometimes Helen heard music coming from his room, played so loud she could feel the bass through the floors, but more often there was just that oppressive silence. She tried making conversation during the few times their paths crossed, asking about school, about friends, about his interests. Carl's responses were polite but minimal, always delivered with that same exhausted tone, always accompanied by that unconscious rubbing of his ear. By the second week, Helen had started paying closer attention to the boy's behavior, and what she observed deeply concerned her. Carl wasn't sleeping properly. She could tell by the dark circles under his eyes that seemed to deepen each day, by the way he dozed off at the breakfast table, by the coffee cups she found hidden in his room. 5 or 6 a day, far too much caffeine for someone his age. When she cleaned his bedroom, she noticed the sheets were often soaked with sweat, twisted and pulled from the mattress as if he'd been fighting something in his sleep. There were bottles of over-the-counter pain medication scattered across his desk and nightstand. Ibuprofen, acetaminophen, aspirin, enough to stock a small pharmacy. His laptop was always open to the same medical websites, search histories full of queries about ear pain, tinnitus, hearing problems, and something called exploding head syndrome. The blinds in his room were always drawn tight, creating a cave-like atmosphere even in the middle of the day. And there were tissues everywhere, some spotted with small amounts of blood, though when Helen mentioned this to the house manager, she was told Carl had always been prone to nosebleeds. 3 weeks into her employment, Helen witnessed something that made her realize the situation was more serious than anyone understood. She was dusting the library when she heard a crash from the kitchen. Running in, she found Carl on the floor, not unconscious but curled into himself, both hands pressed against his ears, tears streaming down his face. When she knelt beside him, asking what was wrong, he looked at her with such desperation that it took her breath away. "It won't stop moving," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I can feel it moving and it won't stop." Before she could ask what he meant, Rick appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion from his study. But instead of rushing to his son's side, he stood there, jaw clenched, frustration clear on his face. "Carl, we've been through this. The doctor said it's anxiety. You need to stop this behavior and pull yourself together." The coldness in his voice made Helen's stomach turn. This wasn't a father comforting his child. This was a CEO dealing with an inconvenient disruption to his schedule. Carl struggled to his feet, shaking, still pressing one hand against his right ear. "Dad, please, something's wrong. I know something's wrong. Why won't you believe me?" But Rick was already turning away, checking his phone, his mind clearly back on whatever deal or meeting was waiting for him. "We've been to 3 specialists, Carl. They all said the same thing. It's psychological. You're stressed about college applications. You miss your mother. I get it. But this dramatics needs to stop. Helen, please help him to his room." And with that, he was gone, leaving Helen alone with a 17-year-old boy who looked like he was drowning in plain sight. She helped Carl upstairs, and as they walked, he leaned heavily against her, whispering over and over, "Nobody believes me. Nobody ever believes me." That night, Helen lay awake thinking about what she'd witnessed. She thought about her own childhood, about the times adults had dismissed her concerns, told her she was imagining things, making too big a deal out of nothing. She thought about how it felt to be in pain and have no one take that pain seriously. The next morning, Helen made a decision. She would pay attention to Carl in a way no one else seemed willing or able to do. She started documenting everything she observed, creating a detailed log of his symptoms and behaviors. She noted that his problems were always worse at night and in the early morning. She observed that he avoided lying on his right side, always sleeping turned to the left. She saw him flinch whenever someone approached from his right, as if protecting that side of his head. She noticed dark stains on his pillowcases that didn't look like sweat or blood but something else, something with an unusual texture. When she washed his sheets, she sometimes found tiny dark specks, almost like coffee grounds but different somehow. She started timing his episodes, realizing they followed a pattern. Every few hours he would suddenly stop whatever he was doing, grab his ear, and stand perfectly still for 30 to 40 seconds, as if waiting for something to pass. One afternoon, while Rick was at a conference in San Francisco, Helen found Carl in the music room, sitting at his mother's piano but not playing, just sitting there with his head in his hands. She sat down beside him, not saying anything at first, just being present. After a few minutes, Carl spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She would have believed me. Mom would have known something was wrong." Helen's heart broke a little at the pain in his voice. "Tell me what you're experiencing," she said gently. "I promise I'll listen." Carl looked at her, searching her face as if trying to determine if she was sincere. Then, slowly he began to talk. He told her it had started about 6 months ago, just a feeling of fullness in his right ear like when you go up in an airplane. He'd mentioned it to his father, but Rick had been in the middle of a major acquisition and had barely looked up from his laptop. Then came the pain, sharp and sudden like someone was stabbing him with a needle. The family doctor had looked in his ear, said it was probably just wax buildup, and prescribed some drops that did nothing. Then came the sounds. Not ringing like typical tinnitus but something else. Scratching. Clicking. A rustling like paper being crumpled. Sometimes he swore he could feel something moving, actually moving inside his ear canal, but that was impossible, wasn't it? He'd been to an ENT specialist who'd done a basic examination, found nothing unusual, and suggested it might be stress-related. A second specialist had said the same thing. A third had prescribed anti-anxiety medication that Carl had tried for a week before the side effects became unbearable. Through it all, Rick had grown increasingly impatient, convinced his son was either seeking attention or cracking under the pressure of being a billionaire's heir. The symptoms got worse after his mother died, which only reinforced Rick's belief that this was all psychological, all grief manifesting as physical symptoms. Carl had stopped mentioning it to anyone after that, learning to suffer in silence, to hide his wincing, to muffle his cries at night when the sensation became unbearable. "Last week," Carl continued, his voice shaking, "I felt something touch my eardrum. From the inside. I know how crazy that sounds, but I felt it, like something tapped against it. And sometimes late at night I hear this sound like something breathing. But not me breathing. Something else." Helen felt a chill run down her spine. Everything in her was screaming that this boy was telling the truth, that something was genuinely, physically wrong. She thought about all the dismissed ailments throughout history that turned out to be real, all the patients labeled hysteric or anxious who were actually suffering from undiagnosed conditions. She made another decision then, one that would change everything. "Carl," she said, "would you let me look? I know I'm not a doctor, but sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can see things others miss." Carl looked surprised, then grateful, then nervous. "You'll think I'm crazy too," he said. "I promise you I won't," Helen replied. "Let me just look." They went to the bathroom where the light was brightest. Helen had Carl sit on the counter, his head turned to give her the best angle. She used the flashlight on her phone, getting as close as she could to peer into his ear canal. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the normal pink tissue of a healthy ear. But then Carl winced, that same 30-second freeze she'd observed before, and she kept watching. That's when she saw it. Just for a second, so quick she almost thought she'd imagined it. Movement. Something dark retreating deeper into the ear canal. Helen's hands started trembling, but she kept her voice steady. "Carl, I need you to stay very still. I'm going to get some things from the first aid kit and we're going to take a closer look, okay?" Carl nodded, hope and fear battling in his eyes. Helen retrieved the emergency kit from the hall closet, finding a pair of long tweezers and a magnifying glass Rick apparently used for examining contracts' fine print. She returned to find Carl exactly where she'd left him, rigid with anxiety. "I need you to trust me," she said. "If there's something in there, we need to get it out. But if at any point you want me to stop, just say the word." Carl nodded again, gripping the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles went white. Helen positioned the magnifying glass and looked again, this time prepared for what she might see. The ear canal looked normal at first glance, but she waited, watching, and then she saw it again. Movement. Definite, undeniable movement. Something dark and segmented, pulling back from the light. Her stomach turned, but she forced herself to stay calm. Using the tweezers with exceptional care, she reached into Carl's ear. He gasped, his whole body tensing, but he didn't pull away. She could feel resistance, something trying to retreat from the tweezers, and that's when the full horror of the situation hit her. There was something alive in this boy's ear. Something that had been living there for months. With infinite patience and steadiness she didn't know she possessed, Helen managed to grasp something with the tweezers. Carl made a sound somewhere between a sob and a sigh as she slowly, carefully began to pull. What emerged first looked like a piece of dark thread, but as she continued to extract it, the truth became hideously clear. It was an insect, but not just any insect. It was a cockroach, and not a small one. As she pulled it free, Carl let out a cry of relief so profound it brought tears to her eyes. But Helen's relief turned to horror as she realized the cockroach wasn't alone. Attached to it, coming out with it, were eggs. Dozens of small white eggs that had been laid deep in Carl's ear canal. Some had already hatched, she realized with growing revulsion. The movement Carl had been feeling, the sounds he'd been hearing, it hadn't been one insect but multiple ones, a breeding colony that had made his ear their home. The full extraction took several agonizing minutes. Helen pulled out 3 more small cockroaches, all juvenile, all alive, all fighting to stay in what had become their habitat. She extracted what seemed like hundreds of eggs, some empty, some still full. Debris that she realized with horror was insect waste and shed skin. By the time she was done, Carl was sobbing openly, his whole body shaking with relief and trauma. The collection of horrors she'd removed filled a small glass jar, a nightmare made tangible. That's when Rick walked in, home early from his trip, and saw the scene before him. His son crying on the bathroom counter, Helen holding a jar of insects and eggs, the tweezers still in her hand. The color drained from his face as the reality of what he'd dismissed for 6 months stared back at him from that jar. "My God," he whispered, staggering backward. "Carl? Oh my God, Carl, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." For the first time since his wife's death, Rick Grimes broke down completely. He pulled his son into his arms, both of them crying, 18 months of suppressed grief and 6 months of dismissed suffering pouring out in that bathroom. Helen quietly called for an ambulance, knowing Carl would need immediate medical attention to ensure no damage had been done to his eardrum and to check for any remaining insects or eggs. As they waited for the paramedics, Rick held his son, whispering apologies over and over. "I should have listened. I should have believed you. I'm so sorry. Your mother would never have let this happen. She would have known. She always knew." The hospital visit revealed the full extent of what Carl had endured. The insects had indeed damaged his eardrum, though thankfully not permanently. There was significant inflammation and some infection that would require weeks of treatment. The doctor who examined him was shocked that Carl had managed to function at all with such a severe infestation. They determined that a pregnant cockroach had likely crawled into Carl's ear while he slept one night 6 months ago, during the period when his grief had been at its worst and his self-care had declined. The warm, dark, moist environment of the ear canal had provided perfect breeding conditions. The insects had been feeding on dead skin cells and ear wax, growing, multiplying, creating the nightmare that Carl had lived with for half a year. The psychological impact was even more severe than the physical damage. Carl had developed serious anxiety and trust issues from months of having his very real suffering dismissed as imaginary. The story that emerged in the following weeks painted an even more heartbreaking picture. Helen learned from the household staff that Carl had tried multiple times to get help. He'd gone to the school nurse repeatedly, only to be sent back to class with acetaminophen. He'd made 3 separate appointments with different doctors using his own credit card, trying to get someone to take him seriously. He'd even recorded the sounds coming from his ear on his phone, but the quality wasn't good enough to convince anyone. He'd researched extensively online, finding similar cases, printing out articles to show his father, but Rick had been too busy with a major merger to pay attention. The housekeeper before Helen had noticed Carl's distress but had been told firmly by Rick not to encourage what he called attention-seeking behavior. The recovery process was slow and difficult. Carl needed therapy to deal with the trauma of both the infestation and the months of being disbelieved. He had developed a fear of sleeping, afraid something might crawl into his ears again. He compulsively cleaned his ears multiple times a day and had panic attacks at the sound of any insect. But slowly, with proper support, he began to heal. Rick transformed completely as a father. He took a 6-month sabbatical from his company, the first break he'd taken in 20 years. He attended every therapy session with Carl, facing his own guilt and grief over his wife's death and his failure as a parent. He learned to listen, really listen, not just to Carl but to everyone around him. The man who had scheduled his life in 15-minute increments learned to sit still, to be present, to understand that success meant nothing if you lost your family in the process. Helen stayed with the family through Carl's recovery. She became more than an employee. She became the maternal figure Carl desperately needed and the friend Rick hadn't realized he was missing. She was there when Carl had his follow-up appointments, confirming that his ear had fully healed. She was there when he graduated from Preston Academy, standing beside Rick as they cheered him crossing the stage. She was there when Carl decided to take a gap year before college, wanting to travel and experience life without the constant pain he'd endured for so long. The night before Carl left for his trip to Europe, the 3 of them sat in the kitchen, sharing Chinese takeout and looking through old photo albums. They found pictures of Margaret, and for the first time, they could talk about her without the conversation being cut short by Rick's need to return to work. "She would have been proud of you," Rick told his son. "Of how strong you were, even when no one believed you." Carl shook his head. "I wasn't strong. I just didn't have a choice." "But Helen," he turned to her, "you gave me a choice. You chose to believe me when no one else would. You saved my life." Helen felt tears prick her eyes. "You saved your own life by never giving up, by keeping fighting even when everyone told you that you were wrong. That takes a kind of courage most people never have to find." Rick reached across the table, taking both their hands. "We've all saved each other, I think. Margaret always said that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when things get hard. Helen, you showed up." The story could have ended there, with healing and hope and a family rebuilt from trauma. But there was one more chapter to be written. 6 months after the incident, Rick established the Margaret Grimes Foundation for Invisible Illnesses, dedicated to funding research and treatment for conditions that are often dismissed or misdiagnosed. Carl became the foundation's youth ambassador, traveling to schools and hospitals to share his story, to tell other young people that their pain is real, their suffering is valid, and they deserve to be heard. Helen was offered a position as the Foundation's Director of Patient Advocacy, using her gift for noticing what others miss to help families navigate the medical system. The Foundation's first initiative was to provide free second opinions for any young person whose symptoms had been dismissed as psychological without thorough physical examination. In his first public speech about his experience, Carl stood before an audience of hundreds and said something that resonated far beyond that room. Pain that is dismissed doesn't disappear. It just gets lonelier. When we tell someone their suffering isn't real, we don't cure them, we isolate them. My story is extreme, but it's not unique. How many people right now are living with something eating away at them, literally or figuratively, while the world tells them it's all in their head? How many parents are too busy to notice their children drowning? How many employees stay silent because they know their bosses won't listen? How many patients give up because doctor after doctor won't believe them? My mother used to say that listening is love in action. It took a stranger who chose to listen to save me from months of agony. But it shouldn't take a stranger. It shouldn't take an infestation. It shouldn't take a crisis for us to believe each other. The speech went viral not because of the shocking nature of what had happened to Carl, but because of the universal truth it contained. Thousands of people shared their own stories of being dismissed, of suffering in silence, of the moment someone finally believed them. Parents reached out, admitting they'd been too focused on work to notice their children's struggles. Doctors acknowledged the need to listen more carefully to their patients. The cockroach story became secondary to the human story, a story about the danger of dismissing others' pain, about the power of believing someone when they say they're hurting, about the courage it takes to keep fighting for help when the world tells you you're imagining things. 1 year after the incident, Carl was preparing to start college, planning to study medicine with a focus on diagnostic medicine. Rick had restructured his entire company to allow for better work-life balance, not just for himself but for all employees. Helen had helped dozens of families through the Foundation, becoming known as the woman who saw what others missed. They still met for dinner every Sunday, a tradition that started during Carl's recovery and continued even as their lives moved in different directions. During one of these dinners, Carl asked Helen a question he'd been thinking about for months. How did you know to believe me? When everyone else thought I was making it up, why did you take me seriously? Helen thought for a moment before answering. Because I've been where you were, maybe not with insects in my ear, but I've been dismissed and ignored. I know what it looks like when someone is drowning and everyone else thinks they're waving. And I made a promise to myself a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to be the person who believed someone, I would be that person. Rick added quietly, I learned something through all of this. Success isn't about what you build or how much money you make. It's about whether the people you love feel safe enough to tell you when they're hurting. I failed that test catastrophically. Margaret would have passed it without even trying. But I'm grateful for second chances, for Helen, and for you, Carl, for not giving up on me even when I gave up on you. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, a family forged not by blood but by trauma, trust, and the choice to show up for each other. Outside, life continued its normal pace, but inside that kitchen, they had found something extraordinary in their ordinary Sunday dinner. The knowledge that being heard, being believed, being seen can literally save a life. Think about this story for a moment. What would you have done if you were in Helen's position? Would you have risked your job to help a teenager whose own father didn't believe him? If you were Rick, living with the guilt of dismissing your child's pain for 6 months, could you forgive yourself? Have you ever been in Carl's position, knowing something is wrong but having no one believe you? The terrifying truth is that versions of this story happen every day. Maybe not with insects, but with pain that gets dismissed, with suffering that gets ignored, with cries for help that go unheard. We live in a world that often values productivity over presence, achievement over attention, success over sensitivity. We're taught to push through pain, to not complain, to handle things on our own. But Carl's story reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is keep asking for help, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is believe someone when they say they need it. How many times have we told someone, especially a young person, that what they're experiencing is just stress, or all in their head? How many times have we been too busy to really listen when someone we love is trying to tell us something important? How many Carls are out there right now, suffering in silence because their pain has been dismissed so many times they've stopped trying to be heard? And perhaps most importantly, how many of us have the courage to be like Helen, to risk our comfort and convenience to help someone whom everyone else has written off? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary ones. Because somewhere right now, someone is living with their own version of something crawling inside them, whether physical or emotional, and they're wondering if anyone will ever believe them enough to help. This story haunts people not because of the insects, though that image is certainly disturbing, but because it reveals an uncomfortable truth about human nature. We often dismiss what we don't understand. We minimize others' pain when acknowledging it would require us to stop and pay attention. We tell ourselves that if something were really wrong, it would be more obvious, more provable, more convenient to address. But suffering doesn't always announce itself clearly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides. Sometimes it looks like a teenager rubbing his ear while everyone assumes he's fine. The real horror in this story isn't what was living in Carl's ear. It's how long it was allowed to live there because no one thought to truly look. As you go about your life after hearing this story, perhaps you'll notice things differently. Perhaps you'll pay closer attention when someone mentions chronic pain or ongoing discomfort. Perhaps you'll think twice before dismissing someone's concerns as anxiety or attention-seeking. Perhaps you'll remember that behind every complaint is a person who is choosing to trust you with their truth, and how you respond to that trust can literally change their life. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about a boy with insects in his ear. It's a story about all of us, about how we treat each other, about whether we choose to believe or dismiss, to investigate or ignore, to show up or turn away. Carl Grimes recovered fully from his physical ordeal, but he carries with him the knowledge of what it feels like to suffer while the world tells you you're imagining things. Rick Grimes rebuilt his relationship with his son, but he lives with the knowledge that his wealth and success meant nothing when his child needed him most. And Helen Simmons? She became proof that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply believe someone when they say they're in pain. One person choosing to listen, choosing to look closer, choosing to care, that made all the difference. In a mansion with 42 rooms, it wasn't the billionaire or the specialists or the expensive doctors who solved the mystery. It was a 26-year-old woman who remembered what it felt like to be unheard and decided that no one should have to feel that way on her watch. So I ask you again, what would you do if you were in that situation? Would you be Rick, too busy to notice? Would you be Carl, eventually giving up on being heard? Or would you be Helen, taking the time to truly see what everyone else missed? The answer to that question might just determine whether someone in your life suffers in silence or finds the help they desperately need. Because we all have the power to be someone's Helen. We all have the ability to be the person who finally listens, who finally believes, who finally helps. The question is whether we'll choose to use that power or whether we'll be too busy, too skeptical, or too afraid to try. The Grimes family story spread far beyond their immediate circle, touching lives across the country and around the world. Medical schools began using it as a case study in the importance of listening to patients. Parenting groups discussed it as a cautionary tale about the cost of prioritizing work over family. Mental health advocates pointed to it as an example of how physical symptoms are sometimes dismissed as psychological, leading to prolonged suffering. But perhaps most importantly, individuals who had their own stories of being dismissed found comfort in knowing they weren't alone. The comment sections of articles about Carl's story filled with thousands of personal accounts. People who had fought for years to get diagnosed with chronic illnesses, parents who had advocated tirelessly for their children's needs, patients who had changed doctors dozens of times before finding someone who would listen. What started as one family's nightmare became a catalyst for change in how we think about belief, trust, and the responsibility we have to each other. The image of Helen carefully extracting those insects became less about the horror of what was removed and more about the compassion of someone willing to look closer when everyone else had looked away. It reminded us that heroes don't always wear capes or carry stethoscopes. Sometimes they wear aprons and carry dust cloths, and they save lives not through dramatic gestures but through the simple act of paying attention. Every person who hears this story walks away with the same questions echoing in their mind. Who in my life might be suffering in silence? What pain am I dismissing as drama? What cries for help am I too busy to hear? These questions don't have easy answers, but asking them is the first step toward ensuring that no one we love has to endure what Carl endured. The story serves as a permanent reminder that wealth cannot buy health, that success means nothing if we fail the people we love, and that sometimes the most valuable thing we can offer someone isn't advice or solutions but simply the gift of being believed. In a world full of noise, choosing to listen is a radical act. In a world full of skepticism, choosing to believe is revolutionary. And in a world where everyone is too busy to stop, choosing to pay attention can literally save a life. Carl's ear healed completely, leaving only the faintest scar. But the deeper wounds, the months of isolation, the trauma of being disbelieved, the fear that came from suffering alone, those took much longer to heal. They required not just medical treatment but human connection, not just therapy but trust, not just time but the consistent presence of people who chose to believe him even when his story seemed impossible. As we close this chapter of the Grimes family story, remember that it's not really closed at all. Because somewhere, right now, there's another Carl, another person suffering while the world tells them it's all in their head. There's another Rick, too busy with success to notice failure happening in his own home. And hopefully there's another Helen, someone who will choose to look closer, listen harder, and believe in what others dismiss. The question is, which one will you be? The choice we make in answering that question doesn't just determine the kind of person we are, it determines the kind of world we create. A world where suffering is dismissed or one where pain is acknowledged. A world where busy matters more than present or one where showing up matters most. A world where we wait for proof before offering help or one where we believe people when they say they're hurting. Carl Grimes spent 6 months with insects living in his ear because the adults in his life couldn't believe something so horrible could be true. But the real tragedy wasn't the insects. It was the isolation, the dismissal, the feeling that his pain didn't matter enough to investigate. That's the tragedy that plays out in millions of lives every day, in ways less dramatic but no less damaging. And that's the tragedy that each of us has the power to prevent, one act of listening at a time, one choice to believe at a time, one moment of stopping to really see someone at a time. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not insects, not medical mysteries, not even family dysfunction. It's about the human need to be heard, to be believed, to matter enough that someone will stop their busy life and pay attention to our pain. Helen Simmons still works with families, though now through the foundation rather than as a maid. She often says that the most important thing she ever did wasn't pulling insects from Carl's ear but believing him when he said something was wrong. Rick Grimes, once one of the country's most driven executives, now speaks at business conferences about the importance of presence over productivity. He tells rooms full of CEOs that the biggest deal he ever closed meant nothing compared to the moment he finally heard his son's pain. And Carl? Carl is studying to become the kind of doctor he needed but couldn't find. One who listens first and diagnoses second. One who believes patients even when their symptoms seem impossible. One who understands that sometimes the most important medical tool isn't a stethoscope or an MRI machine but an open mind and a willingness to look closer. Their story reminds us that in a world full of noise, the sound of someone really listening is the most beautiful thing we can hear. That in a world full of dismissal, being believed is the most powerful medicine. And that in a world where everyone is too busy to stop, choosing to pay attention is the most valuable gift we can give. So the next time someone tells you they're in pain, remember Carl. Remember the 6 months he suffered because no one believed him. Remember Helen, who chose to look when everyone else looked away. Remember that you have the power to be the person who finally listens, who finally believes, who finally helps. Because that's all any of us really wants, to be heard, to be believed, to matter enough that someone will stop and help when we say we're hurting. And that's something every one of us can give, if we just choose to pay attention.